Helm Hammerhand is one of the most famous and revered kings of Rohan, his legend enduring in the hearts of his people for over 300 years after his death. However, while many speak of his bravery, courage and endurance, they often overlook Helm as a king. Today on Tales of the Eldar, we will explain why Helm wasn't one of Rohan's best kings and why he actually may be among his worst. Before answering this question, we must first understand Rohan's history, mainly its history with the Dunlendings. Before there was Rohan, there was Caernarfon, a Gondorian province. As Gondor's power dwindled throughout the Third Age, Caernarfon's population began to decline, and many Dunlendings began to cross the Isen and settle in the province's western parts. This was of little importance to the kings and later stewards of Gondor, whose main focus was against Mordor and its allies. However, things changed in 2510, when Caernarfon was given to the Eotheod, who would later become the Rohirrim. Under the rule of their second king, Brego, the Rohirrim encountered the Dunlendings, and the two peoples never got along well. The Rohirrim viewed the Dunlendings as illegal occupiers, and the Dunlendings viewed the newcomers as invaders from the north. Conflicts soon emerged, and under Bregor's successor, Aldor, all Dunlendings were driven out of the lands which they inhabited for centuries. As you may guess, this only paved the way for more strife. Soon after the death of Aldor in 2645, Dunlendings began to creep back into Rohan, settling in the Westfold and in the mountain glens both west and east of Isengard, with some even going as far as the eaves of Fangorn Forest. In the days of Deor, the seventh king, they became hostile, and Deor led an expedition north in order to discover how his enemies managed to cross the Isen, as its fords were always guarded. After defeating an army of Dunlendings, Deor discovered that Isengard had fallen to the wild men. With no way to retake the fortress, Deor withdrew back, and for the following 40 years, the conflict grinded into a stalemate. All of this leads us to Deor's grandson, Helm, who came to the throne in 2741. During the first years of his reign, a man named Freka grew to power in the West March, Rohan's westernmost part. Freka claimed to be a descendant of King Freawain of Rohan, which was likely a lie. He also had some Dunlendish blood in his veins, like most West Marchers. Although he was technically a vassal of Helm, Freka had a lot of autonomy, as he built a stronghold at the source of the river Adorn and controlled lands south of the river, outside Rohan's borders. In 2754, Freka showed up at one of Helm's councils, asking that the king's unnamed daughter be wed to his son, Wulf. Helm refused and instead made a joke about how fat Freka has become. The situation soon escalated, and it all ended up with Helm punching Freka in the head, killing him, and declaring his followers as enemies of Rohan. After this, Wulf fled into Dunland, as Helm ordered that the West March be put under martial law. 4 years later, Easterlings invade Rohan from across the Anduin. At that time, 3 fleets from Umbar and Harad attack Gondor's coasts in a coordinated attack. Seeing their opportunity, the Dunlendings, led by Wulf, invade Rohan from the west. Caught between two armies, Rohan's forces crumble. Helm attempts to hold the forts of Isen, but he is defeated and driven to the Sufberg. The kingdom is overrun, and its people flee into the strongholds of the White Mountains. Wulf captures Edoras, killing Halef, Helm's eldest son, and proclaiming himself as king. Soon after, the winter strikes. Snow is rare in Rohan, but in November it begins to snow, and it doesn't stop until March the following year. This is the long winter, a deadly time for Rohan, Dunland and Eriador. By January, with the Sufberg running out of supplies, Hama, Helm's other son, leads a group of warriors out into the snow to search for food. They are lost and never seen again. With the death of his last son, Helm is consumed by grief and begins to set out alone, with no weapons. He would go into the camps of his enemies and slay them with his bare hands. One night, Helm doesn't return. The following morning, the Rohirrim find their king atop the dike with his knees unbent. It weren't the Dunlendings who killed him, but nature itself. When the winter ends, Frealof, Helm's nephew, leads a group of desperate men to storm Edoras and kill Wulf. Meanwhile, Gondor, who had defeated the invading corsairs, sends aid to Rohan, and by the year's end the kingdom is retaken and Frealof becomes 10th king, starting the second line. So now that we're all caught up with what happened, let's see how much Helm is to blame for the whole war. Did he make decisions that contributed to his downfall, or was he simply put in an impossible position? Well, the first mistake he made was underestimating his enemies. At the time when Helm became king, the Dunlandings had fought the Rohirrim on numerous occasions. Although the hillmen were poorly armed, poorly equipped, and lacked horses, they were determined to reclaim their old lands and had already proven willing to do anything in order to accomplish this goal. Furthermore, the Dunlandings had just recently captured Isengard, one of Gondor's strongest fortresses, and something that will allow them to cross the Isen without needing to control its fords. If that wasn't enough, they also had settlements and outposts within Helm's own kingdom. Clearly, they were a threat that should have been taken seriously. Had Helm simply fortified the western border of Rohan, he would have shown to his enemies that he was prepared for war. From his conversation with Freka, it's also apparent that Helm absolutely despised the Dunlandings and saw them as little better than orcs. Had he survived the war and the long winter, it is clear that there would have been no mercy for the Dunlandings. Compare that to Aragorn, who went on to make peace with the Haradrim and some of the Easterlings after Sauron's fall. The next oversight on Helm's part was the way he handled Freka. His actions and lack of foresight made his and his kingdom's situation later on much worse than it needed to be. While I'm not going to say that he should have collaborated with Freka or accepted his proposal to marry his daughter, Helm's approach to the problem could have been much better. Freka was clearly a powerful lord, both wealthy and influential. He was also much beloved by his people and one with clear ties to Dunland. Remember, he had clear Dunlandish blood and controlled lands that were outside Helm's jurisdiction. When dealing with a powerful and arrogant vassal, you can't simply kill him and expect the problem to go away. Something that was much worse than Helm simply killing Freka was the way in which he killed him. When Freka demanded him to marry his daughter, Helm could simply have rejected or completely ignored this, but instead he responded by literally calling Freka fat, something he knew would enrage the lord. When Freka retaliated by threatening Helm, the king made him walk outside of Edoras before him, something which was both disrespectful and a bit barbaric for a king to do to one of his vassals. But no, this wasn't enough, for Helm didn't just want to humiliate Freka, he wanted to get rid of him, and thus punched him in the head right before calling him a Dunlanding, something which was only partially true. Freka only attacked him through words, and Helm turned to a violent act against an unarmed man. Again, compare that to Bilbo, who spared Gollum's life even after the creature had tried to kill him. Instead of cooling down and doing the reasonable thing, Helm chose to double down on his pride, not even thinking of what consequences may come. And ultimately, Freka didn't actually commit any evil. His death was completely needless and will go on to have major ramifications. In my view, the biggest mistake Helm did in his whole life was not trying to squash the threat when he had the chance. After Freka's death, he declared Wulf an enemy of Rohan and ordered the West March, Freka's former land, to be occupied by his warriors. Naturally, Wulf fled into Dunland, where he was gladly received, and soon enough began to plot against the man who killed his father. Overall, Helm did little to attempt at capturing or killing Wulf, whom he also appears to have underestimated. Instead, his actions gave the Dunlandings a capable leader who could unite and organize them. Another blunder which Helm made that will later come to haunt him was his treatment of the West March. That area was an incredibly delicate balance between Rohan and Dunland, given that for centuries the Rohirrim in that region intermingled with the Dunlandings. As a result, the West Marchers' loyalty to Edoras was always dubious at best. Something very clear was that its people greatly loved Freka and weren't too happy about his death. Had Helm at least tried to justify why he did what he did, it's possible that at least some would have remained loyal to Rohan. But no, instead he put the West March under military occupation. For this reason, those people would later go on to join Wulf against who they considered to be a wild tyrant. In fact, Helm's actions ensured this loyalty for generations, as during the War of the Ring, 300 years later, many in the Westmarch will go on to side with Saruman. Instead of alienating one of Rohan's most populated region, Helm should have realized how important it was to keep Freka's former subjects on his side. By exiling Wulf and seizing his land, he was essentially declaring war on Dunland, thus ensuring that if any conflict were to break out, Rohan would be surrounded by enemies. Make no mistake, there was always going to be a war. The question was which side would the Westmarch support, and Helm's actions and poor judgment answered it in the worst way possible. And guess what? War did eventually break out, and Rohan was attacked by numerous foes and overrun. In the period prior, Helm also appears to have done little to prepare his kingdom, even though conflict was clearly on the horizon. During the war, Helm's performance was quite poor from what we know. When the Easterlings attacked, Helm appears to have moved all of his forces to face them, but when the Dunlandings also invaded, he made the brilliant choice to split his forces and rushed westwards. This was a stupid decision for multiple reasons. Rohan simply didn't have the manpower and resources to fight against multiple foes at the same time. The bulk of his army the bulk of its army was also cavalry, which was very effective when going on the offensive. However, because Helm chose to fight on two fronts, the Rohirrim, neither those in the west nor in the east, had enough riders to fully use that advantage. The Easterlings were clearly the greater threat, and East Rohan consisted almost entirely out of flat open plains, perfect for cavalry charges. Helm should have used that advantage to quickly shatter the Easterlings, and then he would have been free to turn his full attention towards Wulf. Had he done this, he would have gone in history as one of the most competent kings. But he didn't do this. Not only did he divide his army, but Helm also chose the worst defensive strategy against the Dunlandings. He attempted to hold the forts of Isen, even though Dunlanding control of Isengard meant that the forts were now useless as a defensive position, as the enemy could come down on both sides of the river. This is exactly what happened. Helm's army was encircled and it barely escaped destruction by fleeing to the Sufberg. Rohan was overrun and thousands perished, mostly because of Helm's bad tactics. The last error which Helm made was taking with him his younger son to war. From the way things turned out, his elder son and heir Halef would have been much more responsible and would have actually listened to what his father was saying. You may argue that this wouldn't have made a difference, but I don't think we can be so sure. With at least one of his sons alive, Helm might not have been consumed by grief and madness, something which ultimately led to his death. Overall, I think there can be no doubt that Helm Hammerhand was an incredibly flawed king, and his downfall was, to a large degree, his own doing. Had he fully realized the threat that Wulf and the Dunlandings posed, and not acted so hastily, many lives could have been saved. I think it's interesting to compare Helm to another ruler, Eärnur, the last king of Gondor. In my view, Eärnur also deserves a lot of blame for his downfall. That said, I believe that he was even more blameworthy than Eärnur. Eärnur inherited a kingdom in decline that had just recently come out of a long period of war and had lost one of its most important cities. He had no choice but to navigate a very difficult situation. Helm, meanwhile, didn't inherit a realm in decline. In fact, Rohan was relatively stable. All that Helm needed to do was to ensure that his people weren't surrounded by foes and act with a bit more diplomacy. And of course, don't fight a war on two fronts. It never goes well, just ask the Germans.